Thank you so much for joining the Pembina Institute's webinar today. My name is Erin Flanagan, and I'm the Director of Federal Policy at Pembina. I'm joined by my colleagues Matt Horne and Stephen Wee. I'm going to take just a moment to share a bit of context before passing the mic to Matt to dive into the details on climate action in BC and the climate implications of the proposed Pacific NorthWest LNG project. Canada's federal government was elected last October on a platform that contained many environmental commitments. One of the most high-profile and most hotly debated was their commitment to establish a pan-Canadian climate change framework. Since the government's election, they have confirmed that working with the provinces and territories will be cornerstone to the federal approach on climate change. Minister Catherine McKenna has also confirmed that Canada's 2030 climate goal to reduce emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030 is now the floor for federal ambition. In March of this year, Canada's First Ministers met in Vancouver to formally launch this National Climate Plan process. The text released from this First Ministers meeting reiterated that Canada and its provinces and territories will work together to meet or exceed the country's 2030 goal, and, critically, will introduce progressively more stringent climate policies with time, in line with the ambition called for by the Paris Agreement on climate change. Within this context, it's critical to examine how individual fossil fuel projects may fit in with this new and emerging approach to climate change. On that score, we've got Matt Horne with us today, who will describe the climate policy context in British Columbia and the specific climate impacts associated with the proposed Pacific NorthWest LNG terminal. Matt Horne is a member of Christy Clark's Climate Leadership Team, a group of experts from across industry and civil society who were tasked with providing advice and recommendations to BC as it develops a new climate action plan. Matt Horne is the Associate Regional Director for the Pembina Institute in British Columbia. And with that, I'll pass the floor to Matt to begin.
Thanks, Erin. Good morning, everybody. So, as Erin said, we're going to essentially be looking at this concept of a federal climate change test, what it, from the Pembina's perspective, it should mean, and then specifically using the example of the Pacific NorthWest LNG proposal to test that climate test. And I think first question is sort of why does the project matter? And when you look at the information from the recent Canadian Environmental Assessment Report on the project, the emissions from the project are significant. And when you combine the emissions from the LNG terminal plus the associated upstream emissions, it would be among the largest carbon polluters in Canada. And I think from our perspective, whenever you have a project like that that's sort of material in a national or a provincial context in terms of being able to meet targets, it's entirely appropriate that there be a higher level of stringency and a higher level of rigor around the questions testing whether or not it makes sense for a project to go forward. A couple of just caveats off the top in terms of the analysis we'll be showing in this presentation. Right after the presentation on our website, and as part of the thank you note for participating, there'll be a backgrounder explaining more of this, so that'll all be available to you shortly. Throughout this, we're using, all the information we're using is from publicly available sources, so either from Canadian Environmental Assessment data, some work we've done through the BC Shale Gas Scenario Tool. Ideally, we would have been able to use some additional results from the BC Climate Leadership Team process. Those unfortunately aren't publicly available yet, so we've had to replicate those as best as possible with publicly available sources. Yeah, so diving in, this is sort of, we've given this specifically for Pacific NorthWest LNG, but I think these are the same two questions that the federal government should be asking of any new project. So the first is, again, two questions that we think should be asked as part of this climate test. Is BC on track to meet its climate targets? And the second, is carbon pollution from the project being minimized? And just, I think the second one is fairly straightforward. We've got a big project, or a project with potentially large source of emissions. It makes sense to make sure we're sort of turning over every stone and looking for opportunities to reduce emissions. The first question needs a little bit more explanation, and ultimately Canada needs to be on track for its targets. We focus this question on BC because the emissions in this case would entirely be within BC, and I think the way Canada has formulated its climate strategy to date is that it's, for it to be successful, all the provinces have to be successful. So it's a ground or a collective effort on the part of the provinces and the federal government. So in this case, BC has set targets. It has legislated targets. It has a recommended new target from its climate leadership team. So if for Canada to be successful, each of the provinces have to be successful. In that case, BC needs to be successful, which means BC meeting its targets. So I think in this case, the test can be sort of narrowed down to whether or not BC has a plan in place to meet its targets. Right now, unfortunately, we would argue the answer to both of these questions is no, and as a result, in that scenario, the project shouldn't proceed. So we're going to dive into each of those in a little bit more detail to explain why the answer is no, and I think what could change to change those answers to yeses. So again, the first one, is BC on track to meet its climate targets? Right now, the answer is no, and I think there's actually quite a good bit of evidence to sort of look at that. So as Aaron mentioned, in May of last year, pretty much a year ago, the province announced that it was going to be updating its climate plan. It formed a climate advisory team or climate leadership team to give it advice on what those next steps should be. So I was a member of that advisory team. We provided our recommendations and advice to government last November. Ended up with a set of consensus recommendations that hit sort of three main parts of our mandate, which one was to get the province back on track for its targets, two was to maintain a strong economy, and three was to protect vulnerable populations. So the package of recommendations, I think, did a good job of that combined mandate. So you can see in this chart here, which is from the Climate Leadership Team's report to government, the 2020 and 2050 targets the province has already legislated, and a new 2030 target that we recommended for the province. The sort of light blue line that sort of angles downward is sort of what the trajectory of emissions would be if the province adopted those recommendations based on modeling done by Navius Research. The dark blue line is the projection of emissions currently in the province, and that's again, based on the current policy. So some good policies already in place, like the carbon tax, the low carbon fuel standard, the clean energy requirements, but those aren't enough to sort of, I think they've been a good first start, but they're not enough to keep emissions bending down, which is the province's objective. So again, I think the takeaway from here is that there is a pathway to move forward that puts the province on a declining trajectory for emissions. To date, the province has not adopted those recommendations, and we'll go into that in a second, but has largely sat on the fence with one or two exceptions around that full package of recommendations. So I think the current policy trend or the upward trend would still match with an accurate projection of where the province's emissions are headed. So this is in sort of the same context. We're trying to look at LNG specifically in sort of as projects are proposed and what they might look like under the Climate Leadership Team recommendations. So what we have in the left bar here are the sort of three leading LNG projects, Pacific NorthWest LNG, LNG Canada, which is the Shell project, again, another large project in Northwest BC, and the Woodfibre LNG project, which is sort of the smaller LNG project near Squamish. If those projects were built as proposed, and what's shown here is both the emissions from the LNG terminals plus the upstream emissions, and so if they were built as proposed with upstream emissions under current policy, you'd see a combined almost 25 million tons of carbon pollution, so well above the province's 2050 target, and taking up more than half of the province's recommended 2030 target. If those same projects were to proceed under the Climate Leadership Team recommendations, see I guess a significant cut in those emissions, more than 50%. So again, it's the same scale of projects, but different technologies, different practices leading to much lower levels of emissions. Again, that's still a significant chunk, and actually if I take a step backwards to the previous slide, you can see that BC's Climate Leadership Team recommendations don't get all the way to the province's 2050 target. So there's still a fairly significant gap there. And the agreement of the team was that ideally we would have gotten all the way to the target, but recognizing there's still 30 plus years to close that gap, additional policy, additional technology innovation, we felt comfortable leaving that amount of gap between the, I guess, current trajectory with what we know and where the target was. So again, that under the sort of the right-hand bar there with that level of LNG development, there's still going to need to be further reductions if the 2050 targets can be plausible for BC, because there's still the rest of the economy for buildings, transportations to fit underneath that 2050 line. So still work to be done, but also a significant difference from the projects as proposed. And again, just to reiterate, I think the actual scenario we're in would be in the as proposed left-hand bar, because the province still hasn't committed to move ahead on the climate leadership team recommendations. So just to talk a little bit about those recommendations, and as that team was sort of given the mandate of giving recommendations to the province on how it can reduce emissions across the economy, just pulling out those that are specifically relevant for LNG and upstream gas. I'll highlight 5 here. So the first was to increase the carbon tax by $10 a ton per year starting in 2018, and announce that change at some point this year. The second was to expand the coverage the carbon tax in 2021, so that has definite relevance for upstream gas in particular, because of about 40% of the gas sector's emissions right now aren't covered by the carbon tax. It covers all the combustion emissions, but the non-combustion emissions from methane venting or formation CO2 is where raw carbon dioxide is stripped from natural gas and vented to the atmosphere. Those sources are not currently covered by the carbon tax, and the team's recommendation was to bring those under the coverage of the carbon tax. The third piece here, to develop mechanisms to protect emissions-intensive trade-exposed sectors, isn't necessarily to help reduce emissions. It's much more on the competitiveness side of the equation, and a recognition that if BC were to move ahead with that carbon tax schedule and other jurisdictions or competing jurisdictions did not, it would place BC at a competitive disadvantage. So the idea being to develop mechanisms that sort of keep those sectors economically whole if there's a justified need for it, sort of through a transition period where eventually you get to a more level playing field in terms of climate policy stringency. So it's not an exemption, but it is there to protect the competitiveness and make sure that climate policy isn't causing economic activity to move elsewhere. The fourth is specifically with regards to the methane emissions from upstream gas and setting a goal of reducing them by 40% within 5 years, and backing that goal up by regulations and also a multi-stakeholder process to figure out best practices and best regulation. So this is the only one, I guess, all of these ones to date have not been implemented or committed to by the province. This is probably the one partial exception where we both had federal action on it since the climate leadership team recommendations were released, and we've also had the Premier Clark, at the Globe conference this year, committed to aligning with Alberta's approach. So again, no details as of yet, but a high-level commitment to move forward with that piece. Excuse me. The last recommendation was around, specifically around electrification and directing BC Hydro to develop an electrification strategy for LNG and upstream gas. And this one is more institutional in nature and wanting to avoid a situation where proponent and BC Hydro timelines don't align, and you get maybe the economics making sense, but because timelines don't align, projects proceed without electrifying, and making sure that the strategy is in place to avoid that scenario. So that sort of, I guess, wraps up the first portion of this presentation. Sorry, I'm just going to go on mute for just a second to cough and have a drink of water. My apologies, I'm battling a bit of a cold here. So just to sort of wrap up that first section, again, for a large project like this, our perspective is wanting to make sure it fits within a provincial plan to meet its targets. Right now, the possibility for that plan very much exists in terms of the climate leadership team recommendations from the province. To date, the province is not committed to moving forward on those. So I guess the current situation is we don't have a plan in BC to meet the targets. So the second part of this is looking at the carbon pollution from the specific project, in this case, Pacific NorthWest LNG. And are we doing everything we can to make sure the emissions from the project are being minimized? And again, in this case, the answer would unfortunately be no, and I'm just going to walk through a little bit of where there are other opportunities to minimize emissions. So both sort of at the LNG terminal and for upstream gas, there are opportunities to reduce emissions. So just to walk through what some of those are at a high level, for the LNG terminal, can be looking at just more efficient drives for liquefaction. You're looking at renewable energy for the auxiliary power, which is something the LNG Canada project is doing. You can also be looking at electric drives, probably not for a project in the near term because of transmission constraints, but definitely sort of the medium term and possibly for a phase 2 of some of these projects. One place where that electric drive is being used is the Woodfibre LNG project in Squamish. So technically is definitely possible as a technology. Bit of a different situation where they're quite close to the grid in the case of LNG Canada, whereas that's not the case in the Northwest. On the upstream gas, opportunities to limit methane, and again, that's been well documented from a recent federal government commitment and also the Alberta government commitment. So a pretty good momentum both in US and Canada on that issue, and one I think probably of sort of this range of opportunities has the most momentum underneath it already. The second being electrification, and that instead of using gas to power compressors and pipeline stations, is using electricity. And again, some of this is already happening in BC, just not happening at the scale and commonality that would be needed to get on track for a trajectory similar to the climate leadership team recommendations. The last one, this idea of carbon capture. Spectra has done some work in looking at carbon capture as a project. It's definitely a possibility for this project in particular, given most of their gas will be coming from the Montney Basin, which already has relatively low carbon gas, probably not as high a priority, more relevant in the broader set of climate leadership team recommendations, but not as big a piece from this specific project because of where their gas is coming from. So this chart is just trying to illustrate, I guess, the magnitude of the difference under these different scenarios. So the light blue bar at the top shows the emissions from the project as proposed, and it's both the LNG terminal and the upstream emissions combined again. And you see that sort of goes up to just over 12 million tons of carbon pollution by 2050, which coincidentally more or less hits the province's target on its own. So that's not a target we want one project to be hitting, because there's still the rest of the economy to squeeze underneath that target. The darker blue line shows an alternate scenario, and this is one where phase 1 of the project is built to the emissions intensity of the LNG Canada project. So about 40% better than the current project as proposed in the SIA documentation. And the second phase of the project, once there's sort of time to build out electricity infrastructure, following the Woodfibre intensity, which is about 80% better than the current Pacific NorthWest proposal. For the upstream emissions included in there, in this case, we've assumed they all follow better practices of the climate leadership team recommendations, so much higher levels of electrification, much better levels of methane management. So again, you still have a significant chunk of emissions from that project. You're not going to get it close to zero on an industrial project of that scale, but it's doing sort of 50% better than what was initially proposed. So again, I think this doesn't negate the need of that first half of having a clear plan in which the province and ultimately the country can meet its targets, but it does show that there's significant opportunity to reduce emissions from the project as proposed. So a really important part of that question is whether or not there are tools to actually sort of move forward on those opportunities. And focusing on the federal government here right now, because the project is in front of the federal environment minister and ultimately the cabinet for decision on this project. So there are options, and those are options that would really need to be taken in the near term. So just to walk those through, that the federal government does have the power to reject the project. The Pembina Institute perspective would be under the current situation of, as given how the project is designed and given the lack of progress on BC's climate leadership team recommendations, that rejecting the project would be the appropriate course of action. The second one would be setting environmental conditions. So environmental conditions around the emissions intensity of the project, either for phase 1 and or phase 2, would both be possible for the federal government to set. Third would be implementing new federal climate policy, and this would apply both to this project but more broadly. So an example we know the federal government is already moving on would be the methane regulations that Prime Minister Trudeau recently committed to with President Obama. So that's one specific piece of policy that will reduce emissions from this project, but also reduce emissions across the oil and gas sector. And the last would be, this couldn't necessarily be, these last two wouldn't be part of the regulatory process per se, but the federal government has the ability to encourage BC to implement the climate leadership team recommendations and to give them a nudge in the right direction to say we need these implemented so we have a coherent overall national plan. So that's what we're going to cover on sort of the climate test piece. We have sort of a last section of the presentation here, specifically on the international context, because it's sort of been an ongoing part of the conversation. And sort of the argument of the BC government and a number of proponents has been that acknowledging that the emissions in BC would be large and saying, well, that's made up for because we're exporting this LNG and it's displacing coal, so you're getting a net global benefit. That's the argument. But I think there's alternate views out there that exported LNG would be competing with other sources of gas. It might be displacing or delaying the adoption of renewables. So it's actually a more complicated mix or complicated picture. And there's sort of a second question, which actually the Environment Minister raised several weeks ago, is does it even matter? So just wanted to dive into that in a little bit of detail to give some of our perspective on it. So the first, and this is largely based on some research we did for the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions about a year and a half ago, is that from an exporter's perspective, exporting LNG is not a climate solution. And that argument that LNG will displace coal is flawed for two reasons. So the first, and I think there's a chart here drawn from the World Energy Outlook's data, is that the world does not need more gas if we're going to avoid dangerous climate change. I think that's common in perception. So we get more gas out there, it helps displace coal, and therefore you're reducing net emissions. But if you actually look at the data of what they're seeing the global energy mix evolve to, is that in a world with strong climate policy, so that's that lighter blue line, we're actually seeing less gas than in a business as usual or a current policies world, which is the dark blue line. And that's not to say that coal isn't shut down. Coal actually shuts down very rapidly. Oil we also move away from, and natural gas starts to bend down. What the big change that happens in that sort of climate friendly or the 450 scenario is that you have a massive increase in energy efficiency, a massive increase in renewables, and also in the World Energy Outlook scenario is a fairly big increase in nuclear generation as well. So that's how the overall energy mix evolves. So there is definitely natural gas still part of a mix, but supplying more natural gas in the absence of the climate policies that cause coal, gas, and oil to shift down shouldn't be viewed as a climate solution. The other argument, which I think is particularly relevant in a Canadian context, is that it actually doesn't really matter, and that each country is responsible for meeting their own targets. So if China will undoubtedly use some natural gas, India will be using some natural gas, they're using that as part of their energy mix to meet their own targets. So unless you're in a scenario where they're somehow exceeding the targets they've agreed to under the Paris Agreement, there's not a credit for Canada to obtain that. So the framework is set up that each country is responsible for their emissions in their own jurisdiction. So if China is going to meet their targets with some of Canada's gas, that doesn't let Canada off the hook for meeting its own targets. So that's what we wanted to cover in today's webinar. So again, thank you everyone for participating. We're going to turn it over for questions here in a second, and Stephen will be moderating that. So just to quickly summarize, so as I said at the beginning, when you're looking at any sort of major new source of emissions that is material in a provincial or national context for climate change targets, and Pacific NorthWest LNG would definitely pass that bar. It really is important to apply a climate test, so we're supportive of the federal government moving down this path. And the two key questions we think should be as part of that test is, does the project fit within a plan to meet targets, and are the project's emissions being minimized? And unfortunately, the answer is no to both of those questions in this case. So from our perspective as proposed, the project should not proceed. I think if we look at both of those, there's opportunities in BC to move ahead with the plan. There's opportunity for stronger policy and stronger regulatory decisions from the federal government that could change those answers. Right now, we don't have those changed answers in place. And then lastly, on the sort of that international context, I think it's fine to sort of include that as part of a broader conversation, but accounting for those emissions in Asia from LNG exports should not change any of those above conclusions. So with that, I will conclude. I also just really wanted to quickly thank the sponsors, or sorry, the funders for this research that have made this research possible. So the Vancouver Foundation, the Dragonfly Fund at Tides Canada, the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia, and the McLean Foundation. So I'll turn it over to Stephen to moderate the questions from there. As far as we know, they do. So the draft Canadian Environmental Assessment report flagged the greenhouse gas emissions from the project as a significant adverse effect. I haven't seen anything from the federal government indicating they disagree with that conclusion. So in that case, they would have the power to reject the project based on that finding. If the project goes to cabinet, which is by all means, seeing as likely the environment minister has indicated, it likely will be a cabinet decision. Cabinet can still approve the project and give its justifications for it in the light of that significant adverse effect, and they could reject it. So those would be, I guess, the options would be they can either approve it with a justification, they could set additional conditions that bring down the impact, or they could reject it based on the impact.
So this is Stephen at Pembina. I think I didn't unmute myself properly, that first question. So that question that Matt just answered was, does the federal government have the power to reject the project based on greenhouse gas emissions? So if you have any questions, you can type them in the questions box. Our first, we'll take another question here. And question from Elizabeth. Is there any precedent for a project proponent being forced to, by the CEAA or another body, or volunteering to make the kind of climate-friendly changes you're talking about? Is it likely either of these two scenarios would take place with this project?
Thanks. I can take that, and feel free to add in if you want to, Aaron. I'm not, I guess federally or in BC, I'm not aware of precedent on that front. Certainly, if I like looking at Northeast US, I think there's some interesting examples around natural gas-fired power and some recent projects that have been permitted. And what was done in those cases was it was a coal plant shutting down, being replaced by a natural gas plant, and there was concern that stakeholders are engaged in the utilities process didn't want the project operating for 35 years. So there was, I guess, a recognition that it could be sort of there as a bridge fuel or a transition fuel, but not one that lasted indefinitely. So the result was that the regulated settlement was that the conversion from coal to gas was allowed to happen. Instead of being given a 35-year life, it was given a much shorter lifespan, I think sort of 12 to 15 years. And there was also a built-in requirement that emissions from the project ramp down over time. And whether that happened from production ramping down or a technological solution that allowed emissions intensity to drop wasn't figured out. It was sort of left open when the settlement was agreed upon, or settlement was set by the regulatory agency. So there definitely are some instances where that type of requirement has been set, or some precedent. I'm not aware of any federal or BC ones, and I'm not familiar enough with EA precedent across the rest of the country.
So our next question is from Lisa. The question is, I didn't understand the argument that gas doesn't displace coal. That's not what I saw in the chart.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, so maybe I'll just go back to that chart. Um, so there's a few studies that have looked at this question sort of in a, so if you take one further step back, and I think there is a debate around sort of, you can find lots of articles on it, is gas cleaner than coal on a life cycle basis? Certainly from the Pembina Institute's perspective would be on balance, if methane is well managed in particular, you're going to get a sort of a greenhouse gas benefit of switching from coal to gas. The question is, what happens if we just provide more gas into a global energy mix? And work from the International Energy Agency, a study we did for PICS, and a couple other studies that appeared in Nature about a year ago as well, basically make the argument that increasing the supply of gas does nothing to sort of bend down sort of the consumption of coal, oil, and other fuels. So really what bends that emissions curve down is climate policy in the jurisdictions that are using the energy. So that would be things like carbon taxes, cap and trade systems, renewable portfolio standards. So I think when you have jurisdictions, whether it's Canada, whether it's China, India, adopting those sort of policies, that's the mechanism that bends emissions down. Increasing the supply of gas or increasing the supply of any fuel doesn't necessarily increase its adoption. It's the demand side policy that sort of shifts the curve towards the lower carbon options.
Here's a question from Michael. Has there been any attempt at calculating pollution reductions in Pacific NorthWest LNG's receiving markets, China or elsewhere in Asia?
So I've seen, again, I've seen some scenario analysis, and again, this sort of comes back to the same question. So if Pacific NorthWest LNG, and I guess you can sort of look at three scenarios. So if Pacific NorthWest LNG goes ahead and it directly reduced coal-fired power, you would see a net reduction. If it competed with other sources of gas from Australia, say, you'd more or less see a wash in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions. If it actually delayed investment in renewables as a result of that gas being available, it would result in an increase in emissions. So again, it depends on which scenario plays out. I think, again, going back to the earlier point, the key point from our perspective would be that the climate policy be in place to bend down that emissions curve in those jurisdictions so you get more towards the former scenario. So ideally you have a situation where that energy mix is some gas and sort of moving increasingly towards sort of a system dominated by renewables and efficiency. But if you're in the other end of the spectrum of it's some gas still complemented by coal and maybe slowing down the investment of renewables, you're not seeing any benefit. You're actually seeing a step backwards.
Okay. Andre asks, what criteria should the federal government use to determine what are acceptable emission limits for an LNG project?
So this is where I guess it's important to have that two-part test. And I think in terms of a specific project, I think you're still looking at what is sort of best economically achievable technology. And I think maybe where I think environmental assessment needs to move a little bit differently is I think the standard approach to that has been what are the technologies available today under sort of current economic conditions. I think one additional piece we should be looking at as part of that test is how may climate policy change over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and how does that change the economics? So a really obvious example would be the carbon tax in BC, and the climate leadership team has given the province a recommendation to restart increasing the carbon tax annually. So I think we should be looking at these large projects not just under sort of the climate policy and economic conditions of today, but how those decisions might change under a stronger set of climate policies and a stronger carbon tax. Again, I think so. That's what I think you should be looking at in a project-by-project basis. It's still important to look at that in a broader jurisdictional scan and making sure there is space within Canada and within BC's targets for those projects to proceed if they are to proceed.
question from Elizabeth. Two-part question, actually. We'll go with A. Is it likely the BC Environmental Assessment Office or the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency will force the project to make the changes you recommended, or that the proponent will volunteer to do so?
Well, I think my understanding is the BC Environmental Assessment Agency has sort of finished its process on this project. I think all of the LNG projects actively under review. So it would be in either of those other two scenarios. I think the sort of some of the design questions, particularly on the upstream side, would be live for the proponent and their sort of upstream partner, Progress Energy. So that there's a possibility there for sure. And I think the federal government decision is certainly actively a live one. And I think they had issued draft conditions when the draft report came out. Those didn't include any conditions around greenhouse gas emissions. I don't see any reason why not the final report couldn't include that sort of those types of conditions.
Okay, part B of Elizabeth's question. Why wouldn't the proponent adopt these changes immediately on its own? Is it too hard? More expensive? Are such changes practical in this kind of industry from their perspective?
Well, I can offer a few thoughts on that. It's definitely a question for the proponent as well. And I think some of the challenges here are, I think companies and proponents will take different outlooks on the future and sort of different outlooks on how climate policy may evolve. So that's one of the factors. And I think it's interesting to look at sort of the LNG Canada and the Pacific NorthWest LNG project as sort of an illustration that, a good illustration that similar projects, similar sizes, and similar locations don't always come to the same decision. So there's different decisions around sort of the efficiency and level of waste heat recovery that are a higher level of those that LNG Canada's pursued, and similarly they've also pursued to use renewable or decided to use renewable energy for their auxiliary power. And again, I don't know the full reasons as to why they've made those decisions. It could be part of the conversation with their local partners. It could be part of the conversation or partly influenced by where they see climate policy evolving to. But you're definitely seeing different decisions. I think when you look at something like the wood fiber project and going to full electric drive, that definitely seems to be based more on sort of I guess an infrastructure constraint. And to make that sort of decision, you would need reliable sources, large reliable sources of electricity, which wouldn't be available in the Northwest, which is why you're seeing, at least in the near term, the LNG Canada and the Pacific NorthWest LNG projects haven't pursued that technology. I think if you look out to a potential second phase for any of these projects, or if they get delayed, there would be opportunity and time to sort out some of those infrastructure issues if a proponent wanted to go down that path. But in the near term, it's probably not feasible.
A question from Andre. Given the different viewpoints between the federal and BC governments, do you think the acceptance or rejection of large LNG projects will be based on technical, policy, or political grounds?
Well, I think the Environment and Climate Change Minister has already signaled that the decision will be going to Cabinet. And so in my mind, that's a pretty clear signal that it will be based on a combination of factors beyond the scope she has the power to directly decide. So if she were to make the decision, my understanding is she could accept the draft report and reject the project, or she could reject the report and accept it. By sending that decision to Cabinet, it opens up a broader set of decisions. So again, Cabinet has the ability to accept the project with or without conditions. They have the ability to make justifications for why they're doing that. So I think that that does bring in a broader set of economic and political considerations that can and likely will be part of the consideration. I think and also it's important to note that there's sort of a broader set of environmental issues that are also part of consideration. We've scoped this presentation to the climate side of it. There's certainly been a lot of controversy around potential impacts on salmon habitat in the Skeena, and very different views of the, I guess, sort of the risk of those impacts from the proponent and people concerned about eelgrass habitat. So that will also certainly be part of that conversation. So I think you have impacts around salmon and salmon habitat, the climate change side of it, absolutely the sort of the jobs and political considerations will be part of it as well. So where cabinet comes to a decision at the end of the day, I don't know. We're certainly advocating that they continue to sort of take a strong look at the climate side and make sure that's front and center in their decision.
Here's another question. What do you say to the people of Fort St. John who are protesting in support of LNG?
Yeah, it's a tough one because up in the Peace region in November, it's definitely like there's a lot of people and a lot of families that are hurting economically because of the slowdown in the sector. So I think the way I would look at it, probably twofold. I think if the project is going to proceed, we can't sort of cut corners and just run with it without having those climate questions addressed. So I do think we need to make sure there's a plan in place for the province to hit its targets, and also that we're doing everything we can to minimize emissions from this project. That's going to position the province and the country better, both from an environmental and an economic perspective over the long run. So if we're looking at the sort of the sustainability of those jobs, making those decisions in the right way today, I think helps us in the long run. The other is that I do think we as sort of a province and a country have to be looking more broadly than fossil fuels for economic development, and they've definitely been a significant part of Canada's economic development to date, and they're not going to disappear tomorrow, but I sort of look at where the world is headed in terms of moving away from fossil fuels towards cleaner sources of energy. The role in which they have played in Canada's economy and the global economy is likely to be declining. So I think it's important for Canada and for BC to be preparing for that shift and making sure our economies are prepared to compete in those worlds that don't need as many fossil fuels.
Okay, another question. You mentioned the climate leadership team recommendations in BC. Do you think the BC government is going to move ahead with these recommendations?
I don't know. So I think there's definitely the province has been clear they're going to have some sort of plan by the end of the spring. I think the signals we've seen publicly don't give me a huge amount of confidence right now they're planning to move ahead with the package. I think it's still entirely possible, and I think from our perspective we're encouraging them strongly to do that, because I think they've said they want to maintain sort of being a climate leader. From our perspective, I think to maintain or even regain that status, they need carbon pollution to be going down, and to do that, they need to be adopting either a package the climate leadership team recommended or something comparable in level of ambition. So again, I don't know, and I think that it hasn't been a hugely encouraging conversation today based on some of the public comments. But I think if the province does want to live up to that mandate of meeting its targets and maintaining its status as a climate leader, it's going to have to take those sort of steps.
Next question. Many people have said oil sands expansion and its accompanying pipelines have no place in a clean energy future. Does LNG? Thanks, Elizabeth, for that.
So again, I think there's a two-part question here. One's environmental and one's economic. So again, I think the questions we laid out, does Canada have a plan to meet its targets, and are we doing everything we can to minimize emissions? I think for there to be a role in LNG or oil sands projects, the answers to both of those questions have to be yes. So Canada, BC, Alberta all have to be doing their share to reduce emissions, and we don't have sort of an ability to say, well, we're just going to let these emissions happen and not worry about them. So we've got to answer that question domestically and show how those plans, those policies are going to be in place. So I think, I don't know, I look at in a national context or even a BC context as part of the climate leadership team, I think you can have a scenario where there is probably not as much LNG as the province would like to see go ahead, but there is a space where some LNG could happen under very strong policy and the province can still meet its targets. So that's the possibility is there. We don't have that policy in place right now. The economic question, I think, is more around sort of the long run sort of risk that Canada is exposing its economy to by being invested more and more in fossil fuels. And again, it's not a question where there's necessarily a definitive answer, but I think we really need to be looking at that as saying, if we're going to build this pipeline or this LNG project, let's make sure there's going to be a demand for it in the long run, and we're not exposed to sort of dropping global demand, and as a result, dropping prices and dropping revenue and dropping jobs for the province and for the country. So that's a less definitive answer on the sort of on the economic side, but I think a lens at which we should be looking through both in formulating broader economic strategy and considering specific projects.
Follow-up question. If the science on how PNW LNG can reduce its emissions and be a greener project is available to the federal government, and the federal government still chooses not to impose these changes on the proponent, what does that say about the federal government's climate change commitment?
Well, I think in either case, if it moves ahead with a project that undermines a province's and therefore its ability to meet its targets, or if it approves a project with sort of major opportunities to reduce emissions that it's not requiring, I think it does undermine sort of the seriousness of its commitment to climate change. And I think the recent federal government, or the new federal government, has been well, it's been very refreshing from a climate change advocate's perspective. We had 10 years where this really was not an issue in Canada, and the federal government's role in Paris was a very positive one. The working groups on climate change that are getting started, I think, sort of open up a new space for climate action and climate policy in the country. So it's all really positive. It doesn't change the fact that we have to sort of wrestle with some of these large projects that are proposed. And the first steps in terms of the climate tests that Minister McKenna and Minister Carr put forward a few months ago were a positive step. From our perspective, we really need to look at not just an accounting exercise of counting up the emissions, but counting them up and looking rigorously at where they fit into Canada's plan, and also making sure that we're doing what we can to minimize them.
Okay, our last question we'll do for calling this webinar is, would you support the project if the province implemented the climate leadership team recommendations?
So I think from a Pembina perspective, again, what we sort of outlined here is sort of concern about the emissions associated with the project, concern about the lack of progress on the plan. If the province did move ahead with a package of recommendations, I think those concerns would largely be resolved. Our focus on organization would in large part shift towards supporting the implementation of those and design of those, that climate leadership plan. And I think you'd be back in a situation where BC would be a climate leader in terms of implementing really strong climate policy.
All right, that's it for our Pacific NorthWest LNG webinar. Thank you very much for attending. And those are some great questions. I'm going to turn off the webinar now. Thank you.